zoom in on the home within the specific focus of post-conflict reconstruction and take the lead in that area. My first contextual point is that, unfortunately, over the last few decades, and I would say specifically from after 9/11 and the era that has led into countering terrorism and what was allowed in the name of countering terrorism, we have lost a lot of our traditional protection mechanisms that existed for both urban environments and for homes. And as His Excellency illustrated earlier very well, the urban environment traditionally was where people will seek shelter. Now, if you move into a city, you're trapped. The sophistication the cities offer has now driven the warring parties to come up with very intelligent solutions to make sure that the suffering is doubled because of the sophistication in urban areas. And this is a point that we should always keep in mind. We have even the military strategists that used to specifically train their people to avoid urban environments. Now that doctrine has gone out of the window. As long as you can label it in any form related to terrorism, then you seem to have the right to do whatever you please. And nothing illustrates this more than what we are witnessing today in Gaza and Lebanon. In the name of targeting an individual terrorist, I can bomb a whole neighborhood to rubble. Everybody is a collateral damage. Now, legally, we know this is illegal. Morally, we know it's immoral. But unfortunately, we can do nothing to stop it. And very, very little effort has been exerted in that area to really shift the policies and the laws to match those kind of circumstances. What is more depressing is that those who commit those crimes do not refer anymore to the international law as a point of reference. They refer to other crimes committed by others, and they got away with it as the measuring stick. So when you talk to our Israeli friends who start to negotiate with the Palestinians, they will refer to the destruction of Mosul as a reference to the destruction of Gaza. They won't say this is illegal. They say, well, they've done it there. They got away with it. We had to do it because it is about terrorism. So this is not a very promising, I'm afraid not very optimistic point, but I think we're in for a few more years, if not a decade, of this kind of thinking, and we have to work collectively to dismantle that approach. When it comes to our response in the field, what you see on the screen, just an attempt to illustrate the different domains and the complexity of those domains. You can take this to any context. This could be Afghanistan, this could be Gaza, and so on. And you can see the humanitarian tradition. We used to speak about humanitarian versus development. Then we introduced the need to peace build as we do humanitarian work, complicating things further. And we talked about increasingly about state building and so on. But in reality, it is always the counter-terrorism and the counter-insurgency that actually calls the shots in the areas we work. And this presents us with a very important moral dilemma as implementing agencies. Do we keep saying we're here technically? We need access to all sides, and therefore we have to accept that we are being used as an instrument in some of these contexts? Or do we draw a line and say, no, we're not willing to do it? If Israel wants to bomb and occupy Gaza, Israel, by international law, must look after the Gazan population. It should not be delegated to us as international agencies. We're not in a position to do it because of 1, 2, 3. So I think this is my first message for today. The second, which is related to the concept of the home, those of us who were brought up as architects, planners, appreciate very much that the home is not just about provision of shelter. But unfortunately, I think we fail to communicate that to other agencies, partner agencies who operate, particularly in the early days of an emergency response. We need to bring much more focus back on what the home does. and its importance in human well-being, in their health, and it's in building social networks, and encouraging economic recovery and assets. And increasingly, it's becoming also a political capital where we are introducing democratization, state building, etc. And where you're placed does make a huge difference. This is important because that deeper understanding is really about us working with everyone else to bring the focus back on the family, the home, and the neighborhood. And I emphasize the issue of neighborhood because wherever we go, we see people really trying their very best in the darkest of hours of displacement to try and connect to their neighborhood and to take it along with them. If you look at the refugee camps, the Palestinian refugee camps that are spread around the Middle East from 1948 onwards, every refugee camp is made of neighborhoods that are named after the area where the Palestinians have come from originally. Now that takes time and understanding, and it's not what immediate response accommodates. It is what the refugees undertake after they've been placed in a standardized, modularized set of tents, which unfortunately does not take into consideration the very important conceptual point that home is not the one you only want to return to, but even in your time of displacement, you seek to build a home. Every refugee you speak to, they want to be around their families. They want to build a home where the parents are proud, the man is able to go out of the tent, do the work, and come back. And unfortunately, our standards sometimes stop them from doing so. In certain parts of the world, and in particular, I don't know if the slides can move or... Yeah. These images you see, the one on the left is from northern Syria, from the areas around Idlib. Thousands of Syrians have been trapped in these circumstances for the last minimum 10 years. You cannot expect people to continue to live in a protracted displacement under these circumstances. So if they want to build a home, and we're about home building, then our response should go beyond the simple tent. And this is, unfortunately, it's just a technical issue. In some of these places, some people have gone out and brought their own resources and built the walls, but they're not allowed to have a permanent roof on their heads, simply because then they are accused of settling the refugees in this land. We have to understand that people do not settle or do not seek return because they're living in bad circumstances. They seek return because that's the objective. And the more we invest in these individuals, going back to the idea of what the home should be about, the better we equip them to be able to return to be an active member in their own society when it comes to reconstruction. Return is another concern. I go back to our brothers and sisters in Syria. Politically, a lot are of the opinion that we should discourage return because the situation inside Syria is not yet conducive. I take a slightly different view. I think the situation will never be conducive without people returning home and contributing to the change politically in their country, economically in their country, and socially building the networks that they deserve. If we keep doing it this way, the protraction of the displacement will continue, the pressure we heard earlier on host countries will continue, and there will be no solutions. We need to think out of the box, allow people the possibility of testing the waters. And informally, they do all the time. Families split, they send the younger generation in to try and regain ownership of their property, to test the context and so on. We need to be able to change the legislation, the standards, to cope with that. So if you find it impossible to return, if you find it's impossible to return, you should have the right to become refugee again. The host countries have got to be open-minded to the fact that people do not just, it's not a black and white world we live in. It has to be gradual. We have to build confidence and trust. And the last operational key message I'd like to give to our colleagues in Habitat, because of the care and love I hold to this agency as an original architect, and my early days were with them, is that we have to do more in terms of focusing on the recovery, on focusing on the reconstruction, and probably less in competing within the humanitarian domain. The humanitarian domain is important, but it's already too crowded. There are too many actors working within the humanitarian field. It's good to be involved early on, but only to provide the vision and the leadership on how to rebuild homes and housing, and focus on housing and try and take it forward. Without doing so, the context we have really lacks proper actionable leadership in terms of housing. If you look at the spread of agencies and their focus and so on, the space around the built environment is made out of collective responses by different actors without really having a clear vision of what is it we're trying to achieve. And finally, in terms of finance, if we can move, please, the slides. No, move. Next one, please. This is a diagram that I have developed based on experience in many, many contexts. And just to take you through it very quickly, the blue line represents the international media attention, and by definition reflects the amount of money and resources available to any one context. And you see that it tends with time to peak at the time when we're talking about peace, when we are about to grab a deal. There are a lot of resources, everything is available, things are smooth, and so on. But that is, by definition, the time when there is very low capacity within the country to do what they need to do, either because of fragile state, because of displacement, because of people being killed, etc. They're not actually in a position to invest and capitalize on the opportunities, at least the pledges that are made to them during that critical time. And it also comes as the actual needs continue to grow. All the figures that we hear from the World Bank, UNDP, and others, with all due respect, they are of use to the donors. They're not of use to anyone on the ground. There is no point of calculating how many $billion Israel has caused in Gaza unless you plan to present Israel with a bill. And you say, based on international law, reparation, this is how much you owe us. This is how much the World Bank is going to fence off your resources, or whatever the international system is going to do, similar to what the international system have done to Iraq when it invaded Kuwait, similar to what the international system is planning to do with Russia based on its invasion of Ukraine. We have to be consistent. But what does it mean for us in terms of habitat? I think we should go beyond the numbers. We should focus on what you are good at, and that is getting to know the people on the ground. And instead of quantitative data, focus much more on qualitative data and information that is desperately needed, if only to show, and this is the very last point, next please, next please, next. I'm sorry, the presentation, oh, never mind. There was a slide that showed the interaction, the synergies between housing and every other sector practically in any country. We have to capitalize on this. It is by far the most labor-intensive sector. It is the best way to provide employment in large numbers. It's the best way, if it's done properly, to look after your environment. It's the best way to secure communities. It's the best way to build homes and families and preserve social networks. Otherwise, we'll all be meeting here again in a couple of years' time, and we'll be regretting. Those communities that are trapped in displacement at the moment, they're not just not being supported to develop, they're actually sliding back in terms of social cohesion, capacity, conflict amongst themselves, and ironically, the very dimension of countering terrorism is getting higher rather than lower. because there are generations that have been now brought up in their place of displacement with hatred and with a lot of anger that will come back to haunt us all. I'll stop here. I can see my chair is very concerned. It's within the time, I hope, and thank you so much.
Thanks to Dr. Barakat for that, and the really interesting commentary and slides that home is not just a place that you stay, but it's where you seek when there are moments of despair, and that people should be an active participant in the rebuilding of places that have been demolished. So a great way to lead into our very first panel, and that is all about what displacement means to people. And what can be done about it. So, without further ado, let me introduce up to the stage two of our three panelists. We have Dr. Ammar Azzouz, a research fellow at the School of Geography and the Environment, University of Oxford. And just a little bit of background from Dr. Azzouz. Since leaving Syria in 2011, he has not been able to return. And in his book, Domicide, he uses the notion of home to address the destruction of places like Homs and the displacement of Syrian people, both externally and internally, and to explore how cities can be rebuilt without causing further damage to communities that live there. So a great follow-up to what Dr. Barakat was just mentioning. Next to him, you'll see Ms. Ievgeniia Gubkina, an architect and lecturer in history and theory of architecture at UCL's Bartlett School of Architecture. Back in 2022, because of the outbreak of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, she was forced to flee her hometown of Kharkiv. She combines architectural history with cultural studies as well. And you'll notice on your program we have a third guest that was meant to join us remotely, the Honorable Benjamina Karic, the mayor of Sarajevo in Bosnia and Herzegovina. She was elected the second female mayor of the city, and at the age of 30. You're seeing her childhood memories here, because when she was born, in the capital, it was under siege, and so she saw the reconstruction of her city growing up, and now she's actually managing it. Moments before this dialogue began, she had a family emergency, so she won't be able to join us live, but please do give a warm welcome to our first two panelists. So my first question, Ammar, is for you, since we were just speaking about Syria. You have not been there for 13 years. So what does this concept of home, being displaced, wanting to return, mean to you?
Yeah, thanks so much for the organizers for the invitation to this event, and thanks for everyone attending today, and thanks for sharing this. So as it has been noted, I left my country in 2011, in exactly the 17th of November. So it's the anniversary of my displacement is in this month, in a few days. And I come from a city that's called Homs, which is the third largest city in Syria that became to be known as the capital of the revolution. I moved to the UK since then, and I have never been able to return even for a visit. And I'm one out of the 12 million people who have been displaced from their homes inside and outside the country. And as we have seen by Professor Barakat, the type of displacement is so different from people in refugee camps to people like myself living in the comfort of cities like Oxford. But this sense of alienation or being uprooted and almost a sense of exile remains in the everyday life, on remembering, nostalgia, and thinking about one's own country. So I often say, even though I left Syria, but Syria has never left me. On a professional and academic level, I feel I contribute in my scholarly work, and I wrote last year this book called Domicide, which refers to the deliberate killing of home. It's a concept that has been used by many academics and activists and lawyers, including Professor Raja Gopal, who is, I think, attending here and is a professor at MIT. And in that concept, I look at what does home mean for us. Is it one's own home? Is it the city that is being destroyed? As you can see here, my city Homs. Is it the neighborhood, or is it also the rebuilding of home in exile? And I feel that many cities around the world are experiencing violence and destruction in times of quote-unquote peace situations, where mass evictions are happening in many countries around the world, even though we don't see them in the news. So in Domicide, I try to think about what does destruction and violence mean in cities, both at a time of war and a time of peace.
And I think it's also interesting to be rethinking about what it means to return home and what agencies and individuals can do about it. We'll speak more about that in a moment. Ievgeniia, let's cross over to you. I kind of gave a brief introduction of you having to flee Ukraine almost 2 years ago now. Talk to us about what this concept means to you.
So actually...
or maybe push the button. Is there a button?
From maybe...
Yeah, that's it.
Now it's working. Oh, great. So, of course, from personal perspective, my home is my property. In 2014, during the occupation of Crimea by the Russian Federation, I lost my house in Crimea, in Theodosia. And right now, I'm lucky enough that my house in Kharkiv, in the eastern part of Ukraine, it's still more or less okay. It's still there. But it might be lost because each day Kharkiv is under shelling of Russian bombs, missiles, drones, and so on. So for me personally, it means definitely the risk of loss my property. From professional point of view, as an architect, I would say that there is a huge conflict and huge contradiction between what it's supposed to be to build architecture and what it is now. So something that should be considered as safe place, as a shelter, now it might be the danger. You might be buried under rubble of the missile attack. Something that should be kind of stable and strong construction which would protect people from environment. Now that is absolutely fragile. And you can see even on these pictures, even Soviet panel prefabricated buildings, they are definitely now, they are not safe. It's nothing strong in them. They are absolutely vulnerable in front of weapons. And from point of view of urban planner, because my master degree was in urban planning, there is definitely the loss of cities. Hundreds of cities in Ukraine, they are occupied by Russian invasion and Russian Federation. Some of them, they are already vanished. They are already totally erased from the maps of Ukraine. Such cities as Mariupol, occupied and destroyed. Volchansk, Izium, Bakhmut, demolished. And more cities, they are extremely fragile again in face of aggression and invasion. And definitely personal is political. That's why as a citizen of Ukraine and as a member and the person who has political views, and at the same time I still believe in subjectivity and agency of each person, I would say that it's something, loss of home, that shows us that aggressors are allowed to destroy someone else's homes. And that is something about us and our society. And that is a very dangerous point in this historical moment, that we might allow someone to destroy entire cities, countries, nations, and people.
And it's a very painful reality as well to see that happening in all parts of the world. Dr. Azzouz, I want to pick up on something Dr. Barakat spelled out when he said that people must return home in order to be a part of the reconstruction process, despite the instability, despite the lack of safety. What do you think of that?
I think a simple sentence, no justice, no peace. And people who left the country, even if you see them in the most extreme situations, at least they have their safety. Even if it's in a tent, they are safe. 500,000 Syrians have been killed since 2011. And there has been no justice or no transformational, political transformation. And the prisons are full of innocent civilians. And neighborhoods, entire neighborhoods have been destroyed. So the question is to where do they return, and if they do return, would they be safe or not? So reconstruction can propose these shiny designs and tower blocks and, you know, shiny proposals that have been actually proposed by the Syrian government, as in many cities in Damascus. But the question is it for the everyday person? Is that reconstruction providing safety and security for the people, or would their life would be at risk or not? And I think it really goes to the root causes of destruction, of violence and wars, that question of the safety and justice when we think about reconstruction.
And Junior, you were mentioning that in some of the images you were showing us of what's happened to Ukraine, that now as an architect, as you think of how to rebuild and what to rebuild, in the back of your mind, or maybe in the forefront, you're considering buildings that are resilient to conflict and war. Help us understand what that means in a practical sense.
Again, Ammar is absolutely right that no justice, actually no future. That's why I would say that first of all we should think about justice, and then I would say that the destruction of heritage, and I'm trying to stress on this already during all these 2 years of my personal displacement, but still we are there, that the destruction of heritage, for example, was movable and immovable. They are already the part of Genocide Convention of 1948 and Hague Convention of 1954, and this considered as a war crime, and we are still there. So nothing happened. New and new wars repeat and repeat itself all over the world, and destruction gain even new scale because of new types of weapons. So instead of focusing, for example, of very nice and, as Ammar said, shiny perspectives of future reconstructions, I would rather consider and think about our and focus our attention on ways of prosecution of war criminals, of war criminals, and at the same time how to deal with this. And first of all, actually, to call someone who must not be named, Russia, aggressor, as an aggressor. So until aggressor would be stopped, we have no possibility to reconstruct cities, because no reconstruction is possible under shelling and missile attacks. It's just impossible. So aggressor must be stopped, prosecuted, and punished. The second moment, instead of focusing on, for example, some lost cultures or my personal culture or Ukrainian culture or cultures of other victims of different kinds of imperialistic and different kinds of other types of aggressions and conflicts, I would rather focus our attention actually on cultures of aggressors. What kind of cultures actually produce endlessly wars and conflicts everywhere and destroys homes? So I was really very much shocked yesterday because in other hall, within the framework of Expo of World Urban Forum, that is available for visiting a very beautiful and fancy pavilion or stand of Russian Federation, which consists from 3 parts and is quite big, and the narratives that this pavilion actually tell us about, it's all about reconstruction. They have their own view on reconstruction, not only of these cities actually, but the cities such as Mariupol occupied or Crimea occupied in 2014 and so on. So, and the third maybe point that I would stress on, instead of focusing on very fancy words as sustainability, green energy, smart cities, or for example, oppression, suppression, then reconstruction, deconstruction, destruction, let's think about not only about wording, not only about terms, not only about technical sides of, for example, master plans and different plans of reconstruction developments of new cities or older cities that were affected by wars. But let's think about narratives and discourse. Who actually is allowed to form and shape on international arena actually the discourse of reconstruction? aggressors should be not allowed to contribute into the discourse of peaceful reconstruction of our cities. I'm absolutely sure in this, and that's something about all of us, that we are witness struggles and death of people all over the world silently, and we leave all these voices silent and invisible. So
Powerful.
if we would continue doing such things, we will have nothing to discuss. The motto of this forum is it all starts from homes. Then it all will end with homes. We all will be buried under the rubble of our homes.
No, that's a very powerful statement that you've made, and the consistency between what you're both saying is, even if you determine technically what to do, it starts with justice, and it starts with at least owning the narrative of how to rebuild. I know that for Dr. Azzouz, your work has centered on defining domicile, and why is that important to you, to make sure that that term is more widespread and known as it relates to your experience as well?
Yeah, I think we live in this time where there is almost a storm of images and videos that we're so numb when we see every day there are buildings being destroyed. And somehow this like horrible world full of horrors insists to normalize this destruction as if it's like so ordinary to destroy people's homes. But every time we hear about a conflict or a war or a dictatorship, we hear about the numbers. And then somehow the news turn us and turn people into statistics. And we hear also about numbers of displaced people, number of destroyed buildings. We hear about destruction of monuments. There's also this obsession by big organizations to think about cultural heritage and monuments and the ancient and the classical antiquity sites. But less often there is a focus on the everyday, on the mundane, on the bakery shops, on the streets, the neighborhood, the schools, like as we see here, like a reopened shop. We wouldn't reopen shop in a destroyed building. We wouldn't necessarily hear about this everyday life, about the broken livelihoods. And I feel in this concept of domicile, it really brings the attention to the suffering and the pain and trauma of the local people who lost their homes, in a way to re-centralize and shift the conversation from the big monuments such as Palmyra into the everyday life such as people's homes and shops. And I feel in the other hand, there's like a tendency of political powers and dictators and invaders to also use cultural heritage as a soft power and as a tool to say that we are the protectors of heritage. So for instance, Russian government with the support to the Syrian government has bombed and destroyed and killed people in Syria. But at the same time, Russia was portraying themselves as the guardians of culture in Syria, as the protectors of heritage, as using tools to reconstruct digitally like sites such as Palmyra, or to even play a concert I wrote a paper called Playing Pach after killing Syrians, and they actually brought like a concert to the damaged Palmyra to say that we are here to bring stability and peace and culture and civilization to this place that has been destroyed by ISIS. So in somehow these power dynamics are so important, and I feel like we have to move from only our obsession in academia and journalism and also international organization of focusing on one mosque or one church or a bridge to celebrate success of reconstruction and think about the wider question of what reconstruction means for the local people and how can we listen to their voices, understand their wants and needs, and to recenter their voices. And I just want to recall like one of the comments that one of the Syrian academics I interviewed in my research. He told me that reconstruction is like a cake, and he called it like a reconstruction cake. And I feel that everyone wants a piece of that cake, like international powers, international donors, governments, politicians, big organizations. But what's that cake for, and who is it for, and where's the cake piece for the local communities, and where are their voices? So these are all the dynamics that I think about when we think about home and belonging and identity, and how can we focus on the people rather than on what big, powerful, elite organizations want and need.
And it's also a reminder for the rest of us that when we see those images that seem to be contradictory to a narrative of destruction, that someone's protecting the the landmarks, that maybe there's an ulterior motive behind them, so we should all understand that. In our final moments, I just want to know what one statement or fact you want those listening here in the room and around the world to take with them when it comes to the loss of home and your experiences. We can start with you, Ievgeniia.
So again, as we talked about the loss of home or home as quite a huge concept, quite a vast concept, which is sophisticated, multi-layered, and I would say that maybe 1 week ago it was a shelling of Kharkiv again, because my native city, my home city Kharkiv, is under shelling each day. War is not over, and the actually temporarily listed object of World Heritage, Держпром building in the middle, in the center of Kharkiv, was hit by a Russian-guided aviabomb. And international community, international organizations, they should do what they can. They definitely maybe can't control actions of aggressors. They probably not always can reconstruct cities after wars. We all have our own limitations, but in legal way, institutions like, for example, UNESCO, the UN, they could help us to prosecute crimes and aggressors. So, for example, this Держпром building should be on the permanent list of UNESCO World Heritage. Eastern part of Ukraine deserve to have more than one object of World Heritage list. So please help us, if not to protect, at least to prosecute. Thank you.
Thank you for your time.
I think for me, I just want to say that the war in Syria started 13 years ago, and the grief and pain and trauma has never ended. The war has never ended. The exile never ended, and people are really struggling in their daily bread, even inside the country, but even those who have fled are struggling with this sense of being uprooted. So wars don't end when bombs stop, and wars don't end when bulldozers leave. It's just a start of a new phase of grief and recovery and rebuilding. And I just want to say that what Adorno once said, that for a man who doesn't have a homeland, writing is a homeland. And I feel in somehow we all have our own tools and devices to do something. Sometimes it could be the actual work on the ground, and other times it could be a writing that can make sense of what's happening and can share knowledge with the people who are witnessing genocide and destruction and violence in many parts of the world. So it's just an urge for us as academics or researchers to continue the struggle, but also for anyone from any discipline, that we all have our own tools and devices to do something instead of just being silent. Thank you.
Well, thank you both for the work that you do. Please thank our panelists, Dr. Ammar Azzouz and Ms. Ievgeniia Gubkina. Thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Okay, let me, as we're going to make a quick change on set here now, introduce you to our midway performer. He is originally from Denmark, and he is of Palestinian and Lebanese descent. And he has basically been raised in Denmark as well. He's a performer and author who is renowned for his live shows. So what you're about to see here and experience now is the type of thing people tweet and Instagram about. It's poetry, it's live performance, and it's thought-provoking as well. His work centers around his own family's experience of losing their home and having to find a new place of centering in Europe, and it hasn't always been easy. He has a very unique voice in the entertainment scene, and he tackles displacement, loss of home, war, and much more. So please, ladies and gentlemen, enjoy and welcome Mazen Ismail.